Welcome to Fearless Journeys Thriving on Campus, the podcast where we tackle the challenges and triumphs of post-secondary life while exploring ways to thrive mentally, emotionally, and socially. I'm Corinne Jansen.
And I'm Steve Johnson. Today we're diving into a critical and oftentimes misunderstood topic, gender-based sexual violence on campus. So it's a conversation really about breaking stigma and creating awareness and really just fostering a safer campus for everyone.
And we have a guest here with us, Carmen. Would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm Carmen Gunther, and I'm the manager of wellness services here at Lethbridge Polytechnic. I'm very passionate about the well-being of students, and have spent much of my career trying to create space for difficult conversations in really educational settings. And those topics really have included suicide, mental health disorders, family violence, and gender-based and sexual violence.
And just kind of a note heading out into this episode, we really do deal with sensitive topics here. So at any point while you're listening, you feel overwhelmed, please do take a break, reach out to someone you trust, and use your campus resources.
To start, let's define what we mean by gender-based sexual violence. It includes behaviors like sexual harassment, stalking, and assault, often rooted in power imbalance and gender inequality. So Carmen, our first question, what are some of the biggest misconceptions about gender-based sexual violence, and how do they impact survivors and campus culture?
So you're really diving right in, and I think we should, because so much of this issue around the behaviors of sexual violence and gender-based violence really do stem directly from stigma around it and the misconception that we've all been taught. So often as a society, we're really comfortable not knowing, because honestly, it's scary. As a community here, though, it's our responsibility to know. And I think, before we really get into a lot of it, I think it's important for our listeners to understand how prevalent this issue is on our campuses. So we're just going to go narrow in right into our campus. So there was a provincial survey done in 2022 that told us that our students here at Lethbridge Polytech had really had experienced a lot of violence both in their past and as students. So 75% of students who filled out that survey said that they'd experienced some form of gender-based or sexual violence before becoming a student, and 37% of them said that they had experienced it since. And sexual harassment was most commonly the form of violence that was experienced here on campus.
It's huge.
It's huge. Yeah. So I'm really just thankful to you both for bringing this, subject to your podcast. I think it's really important to be talking about it. So I have a lot to say about this. You're going to have to just jump in and interrupt me when you need me to stop. But two important things that I think I want to bring forward are those of rape myths and victim blaming. Rape myths are really common misconceptions about how and why violence happens. So you've heard them, right? Like only strangers cause harm, or if you dress modestly, you can keep yourself safe, or violence only happens towards women by men, or sexual assaults only happen in dark alleys. And we keep it really simple like this so that people don't have to fear the issue and can find safety in the belief that there are things you can do to control the situation. And then really connected to that is the idea of victim blaming. So this is using strategies to lay blame on those who are harmed. So things like, you must have had too much to drink or not watched your drink, or you must have been flirting too much, or your clothes were too provocative. You chose to go in the dark running. You must have misunderstood their intentions. Or why didn't you just say no? Another really common misconception is that it's a women's issue. Mm-hmm. So how many young females are taught or passively learn messages that we must act to protect ourselves from harm? Don't meet up with strangers, don't run with your headphones on, carry your keys in your hand in case someone's in the backseat of your car. When in fact, most people who cause harm are known to the person and are in relationships with them, have connection, or family members. I can keep going, right? I got more for you if you want. Can I talk about one more thing that I think is really a really common misconception is just that although experiences of sexual violence and gender-based violence are commonly known to be that the females are the ones who experience it and males are the perpetrators, this is such a harmful myth. And I want to lay this out right at the beginning of this session together, is that this is an issue that impacts everybody, regardless of your gender, your age, your ethnicity, or your physical or social location. Many boys and men have experienced violence and are not given space to talk about their experiences because of our rigid gender roles and expressions of our sexuality. R2S LGBTQ plus demographic here on campus, our students also experience extremely high rates of violence, and it's rarely talked about.
Yeah, like this, the stereotypes, like you said, that men can't be victims or women should just avoid risky situations. It all contributes to that stigma piece, right? What about, could you share a little bit more of your perspective of why stigma persists?
Yeah, I think it's just, we like to believe that this type of harm doesn't occur. So if it hasn't happened to us, we can ignore it because it's difficult and uncomfortable. And so it challenges our ideas of safety and risk, like I said, right? If it's true that we can experience violence without doing a single thing, then our world is no longer safe. Mm-hmm. But, what if we know someone that has caused harm and it doesn't align with our experience with them? So we push it away and it helps to thrive in silence. And I think that's like a really key thing here is that so much of violence like this does happen behind closed doors and in private spaces. And it's talking about sexuality, and that in general is taboo, right? So societal factors have really taught survivors, and we, in the language of survivors are those that have experienced harm, that when they come forward, they're rarely believed.
Yeah.
And in fact, blamed. So we stop talking about it and we keep it private. So the lack of accountability for those who cause harm plays into this as well. And it really just creates a space in which people are given permission to cause harm, and it'll just be like no one will discuss it.
I think like when you were speaking, a couple of things that came to mind that help the stigma persist is like a lot of the information that we see in the news is those extreme cases. Yeah. So people are like, well, I haven't experienced that, so it's not. And then another piece that probably contributes is just the normalization of jokes, comments,
right?
The way that we talk about things, like even thinking with like video game culture, how people like talk about beating up or like, and that's pursuing an interest. It can be violent language talking that way. And so it's really normalized.
It's really normalized.
So people have experiences and may not even know because it's normalized.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And like I think it's important for us to recognize that like the experiences of like physical violence, like that's not happening out of nothing, right? Mm-hmm. So the things you're talking about where we've just normalized culture where just the oppression of women and those who don't fit rigid gender roles, that like on a daily basis is contributing to why this type of violence happens, and it just goes kind of unnoticed or unaccounted for, right?
Yeah. So just adding to the like what contributes to the stigma, there's another idea that people make false reports. So somebody who is reporting that they've had an experience could be lying. But when we look at the stats, they're really, really low. Carmen, do you want to speak to the stat?
Yeah, for sure. I think this is a really important thing to talk about because, again, when people try to put sexual violence or gender-based violence into a box where it only happens in this scenario and not in other places or spaces, one of the ways that we kind of reject this idea is by believing that people must be making it up. And then it keeps things safe again, right? But really, actually, the rates tell us that only like 2 to 4% of sexual violence reports are false. And that is actually lower than the reporting for other crimes. But interesting that we don't talk about those.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, and to contribute to that too, like it's 2 to 4% of the reports that are made. And we know that not everybody makes a report because they're not going to be believed, because there's shame in their experience, because there's guilt.
And like the rates are so low. Yeah. So the numbers that you ever hear published about it, I mean, there are some statistics that'll tell us that it's like 6 to 10% of people who've experienced sexual violence will actually report to the police because of those reasons. Yeah. So just imagine what those numbers actually are. Right? And we won't necessarily ever know, but recognizing that for most people, it's not the safest pathway for them to come forward.
And we see that all the time with any really mental health issue is we're always working statistics off reported, information.
Absolutely.
So, yes, in this case, I'm sure that the amount of people affected are going to be at least 20% higher than what we're thinking.
So, Carmen, many survivors struggle with feelings of guilt or shame or self-blame. Why is that such a common reaction, and how can we help them reframe those thoughts?
This is just such a devastating part of it. This isn't something that happened because they did something wrong. Like someone did something to them that they didn't ask for. So to put that more simply, like it happened to them, not because of them. And their power's been taken from them. So a lot of this question comes back to me is like, how do we rebuild that sense of power when it's been removed? So it's a common response because it's like the self-blame is a common response because it's plainly taught to us that if we experienced violence, we did something to deserve it, ask for it, or not stop it. I think what I would want to say about this is that gender-based and sexual violence is an experience of trauma. And this is a traumatic experience like a car crash or having someone you love die or facing a terminal illness. So you don't just forget about it and move on, right? It can have powerful impact on our understanding of the world and our mental health and well-being. And it's so important for those who've experienced violence to hear this, right? Like you didn't get to pick this and it's impacted your life and it makes sense that it's caused harm to you.
Yeah, we're validating their experience.
Yes, right? So things we can do to help people process the violence they've experienced is to really just offer compassion, hold space for them, to really talk about what they're feeling and experiencing without judgment or blame. I mean, listen when they want to talk, but don't pressure them to talk. And, don't talk about things when it's not supportive. So much of this comes down to, for the individual, is just self-compassion, right? Like thinking about if someone came to you with a story of harm, how would you respond to them? And so often we separate that and, don't give that same love and care to ourselves. There's so much support available, and I know we're going to be talking about that through this time together. But, I just want to mention here that sometimes those supports come informally with like your peers or your family members or even instructor on campus. But we also want survivors to know that on campus, there's a lot of supports here in this community as well.
Yeah, and sometimes we just don't know where those supports are. So just the simple fact that if they access, even campus resources like here in Wellness Services, we can at least guide them to some more supports.
Absolutely.
So about the impact, talking about the impact, survivors of gender-based sexual violence, they often face a range of mental health challenges, including, of course, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, and more. So, Carmen, what has been your experience in supporting students in this area?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you have addressed that, Steve. Is just like, when I talk about it being a traumatic experience, right? Like there are likely going to be long-term impacts, and it's very unique to everyone. I don't want to put anything in a box here too, because individuals' experiences are unique. But most of my background in this topic really has come from prevention and education, facilitation of workshops, etc. But when I stepped into a support role for this, I was really unsure if I was equipped to do the work, and sit in that vulnerability with someone. But I've learned some lessons, and I wanted to share them here because I think these are really relevant. The first thing that I noticed in my experience supporting students is just, first of all, how prevalent this issue is. Like how many of our students in post-secondary environments have been impacted in their life and just continue to be impacted. The work of, healing and support really has to be led by the survivor. So, we call this survivor-centric. My job and our job here on campus is to provide spaces to explore options for students, but no decision can or should be made by the people who are supporting, right? The person needs to have opportunity to be empowered and rebuild trust. A third thing I've learned is really just how resilient students are. I have heard stories of violence that, still impact me today. And those very students have sought support and forms of justice for their experiences, and to see them thriving and owning their power and using it to inform the way they want to be in this world is really inspiring and hopeful.
So Carmen, how can friends or peers recognize the signs that someone might be struggling with their mental health after experienced gender-based violence, and what can they do to support them?
I think the first thing is really just pay attention. I mean, the signs that someone has experienced harm are actually going to probably show up in the same way that other forms of mental health concerns might look. So this might look like withdrawal or a change in what's normal for them. Maybe they're appearing kind of disconnected or increased anxiety or depression. You might notice sometimes that there's an unnatural response to an environmental factor, right? Like in a certain smell or piece of clothing or color might actually just cause someone to panic. We call those triggers, right? But something that reminds them of their harm. But if you know someone's that experienced harm, really it's just just offer a place to connect, right? Like you don't have to have the answers and no one would expect you to. And I think that's really important because there's so much fear about what you're supposed to say to not mess it up or to make sure you're not causing harm for someone, but really just being present with someone, letting them lead and just helping them kind of explore what their options are is really, all we really want of friends to have to do. I think a huge piece, and I can't express this enough how important it is just believe them.
Yeah.
Believe them, right? Because you may hear something really uncomfortable, but recognize the role that you have. Like you might be the first person, the only person that they chose to tell, and just really respect that and hold space for people because you don't have to have the answers, right?
No. And it's not up to us to make those answers up, right? Yeah.
And the hard part is that there's nothing we can do to change what has already happened, right? So this isn't a fixing situation.
No, and we're not going to fix it.
You aren't going to. And I think maybe just giving yourself permission from the beginning, that just kind of takes away some of the fear of that. Like you don't have to have the answers. You don't need to know what to do next. But just being present with someone and like, hey, I'll help you figure this out. I'm not gonna leave. Like we can explore this together. I can come with you to that appointment, or we can go talk to wellness, or we can go talk to Chinook Sexual Assault Center and just see what they have to possibly support you.
Mm-hmm. Well, and two, when a survivor shares an experience and the person they're sharing with believes them, there's studies that say that their recovery or their experience of post-traumatic stress syndrome are less. So if we're able to be that support and we're able to listen with compassion, potentially this person might be able to recover easier, quicker.
I love that because that speaks to so many, just mental health or struggles that students are having. Like when we hold on to that alone, the weight of that is so much heavier. And like, there's so much power in just sharing your story with someone. Yeah. It moves it, right? Like it literally moves those emotions so that they're not as heavy to bear. And so in this case, absolutely to know that there's actually research that connects the healing of that individual just by having a supportive and validating experience with someone that's just so powerful.
Yeah. And as someone who supports, it's really 90% listening, right? We just have to remember that, just to give that space and that time. And I really appreciate, that you mentioned taking somebody to someone who can help more. I think sometimes when we're helping somebody struggling with any kind of mental health concerns, we oftentimes just try to avoid things. And so just being able to help them get to more professional supports is going to help.
Well, and having that friend walk with you can be less scary.
Yeah.
Even that.
Even if you want support, sometimes just taking that step to reach out can be really hard. But that's a great way for friends and peers to support. Yeah.
So moving to prevention and support, what can campuses do to prevent gender-based and sexual violence, and how can we better support survivors?
That's a huge question. And there's a lot of places we could go. But I think the first thing that comes to mind is just we have to be constantly exposed to the topic. Right. There is just, as we talked and started this podcast today, is like there's so much stigma around it that if we don't discuss it, then, we're never going to be moving forward on the issue. So what we're trying to do here on campus is really just reminding you of the topic of gender-based and sexual violence. And sometimes in fun ways, sometimes in pop-ups, but sometimes in poster campaigns that you're seeing in the bathroom. But we don't want you to forget that this is a real issue that's impacting our students. And there's so many little things that we can learn, right? Like many of our students are coming into post-secondary with really little knowledge on sexual violence and support. And that's to no one's fault, right? It's just that this isn't a topic that's discussed typically in high school settings. And so if your family's not talking about it, maybe you're getting little tidbits of it from your friends, but we don't always know that that's accurate or supportive. So for us, it's like an opportunity when you're entering here on our campus to be able to start talking about a hard issue. We want to bring awareness to what it actually means to talk about gender-based and sexual violence. Like we know it's a huge term, and you talked about it at the beginning, Corinne, like all of the things that fall under. It's a huge umbrella term. Yeah. And so even just bringing awareness to what that is, what consent looks like, what supports are available on campus. I think other things that are really critical in prevention is just making sure that we have safe reporting structures set up and that people know about them. This is really, really important and is best practice to ensure that these supports are accessible to people. We've also done a lot of policy review, and I think that's really important. that's kind of where I work in at the institution at this time, right, is just being able to kind of help advise the changes that are needed in policy and procedure so that when something does happen, we can make sure the supports exist. Otherwise, I mean, I think there's a lot of work to be done in engaging males on campus. Yeah. This year we've tried a few things. There are whole campaigns that exist. You might have seen us handing out white ribbons for the 16 days of activism, where we want to bring guys into the conversation because this isn't a women's issue, right? And I think that's so important that we have allies in this work, right? That we're talking about it together. I think another thing that really helps in prevention is developing guidance tools for staff and faculty who are more likely to receive disclosures of violence, creating safe spaces. Like, if you haven't been to our new wellness services space, this was designed with the idea that we wanted to create comfort and safety for students to know that it's like a place that they can land if they have questions or are experiencing violence or just want to know more. But I guess I really see it as just like pulling back the curtain on an issue that's just rarely discussed.
Yeah. So just getting back, I know that question was big, like you mentioned. With the second piece, how do we better support survivors? Do you have ideas for that?
Yeah, I think there's two things that I'd want to talk about, and that is the Reese platform. So students may have seen, little cards around campus or in bathroom stalls telling you, but this is really an anonymous reporting platform for students that's available 24 hours a day. And it's a place that you can connect to our services. It's a place where you can connect to put a formal report in to the contact team, or it's a place where you can just record your story. Sometimes that can be so healing to just know that you've created a place that's confidential that you can come back to, where you just kind of write the behaviors that have happened or the experience that you've had, knowing that it's there when you need it and you don't have to do anything with it. Another thing that we've really set up and been focused on here in wellness at Lethbridge Polytechnic is just creating a response procedure for students who come forward. For always, we've had students who've come and disclosed to us about violence, and our staff is so supportive and will always walk a student through their options. But we wanted to make that a little bit more formal, where we really created a GBSV, a gender-based and sexual violence response team, who are there and are trained to respond when a student discloses this. And again, I think, I mentioned before, but so important for students to understand that when they come there, it's entirely led by them. They can reach out by email, they can stop into wellness, but when you're having a support session, there's a lot of things that we can offer to you about ways that we can help support you on campus, but everything is led by you as the survivor. Never will there be a decision made without your consent. Never will their information be shared beyond that space unless you want it to be.
And about the Reese platform, now this is, of course, not just Lethbridge Polytechnic. This is a platform that is national and can be used by many institutions.
Yeah. So we really did a lot of research on kind of what platforms existed, and we loved that this was a Canadian-based platform, and there's a lot of post-secondaries using it. And in fact, I believe Hockey Canada also signs with them as a space. There's also different communities that are kind of moving the platform and the opportunity to anonymously report, like in a community-wide setting. So they're community-based Reese. But when you go onto the Reese platform, we're not saying that because this exists across the country that your information is like shared in that way. Like it's entirely confidential. It's password encrypted that only you know. And you connect into our system just by selecting, what location.
Yeah.
Which is really, I think, important to know that people who are using that platform have that security.
Yes.
That they're, not telling the story to 1,000 people, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and too, it is, Polytech has signed on with it, but we don't have the information that's on there. Like you said, it's password encrypted. We don't see unless somebody chooses to connect through there.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And as you mentioned, it's all student-led. It's whatever our survivor wants to share and wherever direction they want to take, that's for them.
Well, and Reese includes 2 local resources, right?
That's right.
They have wellness services on there. They have the Chinook Sexual Assault Center. So even if someone doesn't know where to start, they could start there and find other connections or resources that might be helpful to them.
Absolutely. And, we talk a lot about this anonymous reporting platform, but also really want you to know that you don't have to use that option, right? It's available to you. But if you just want to come talk to someone, please, our doors are open and we'll invite you to talk with us. And even in that setting, most importantly, to know that it's totally up to you. And we're just going to explore what's available to you to support you.
Mm-hmm. And so for other campuses out there who are listening to this, and I hope they are, if you don't have a platform like that, I would recommend, talk to your campus leaders and ask for something similar or something like that, or use the REASE program. Carmen, what about, when we were talking about effective ways that campuses can prevent gender-based sexual violence and support survivors, what about mandatory consent education for employees?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, Steve, because there's a lot of divide on that topic, actually, right? Because, and I think why there's a divide on it is because, yes, initially you're thinking everyone should have consent education. Like, how do we not? And absolutely, like we should all know about what actually consent is and what is a crime in Canada. But then there's also this kind of area where it's like, if we mandate education on consent, there's always going to be those that struggle with the idea that we're mandating it. And it's an interesting thing, right? To mandate and then talk about consent, it becomes kind of like it messes with your mind a little bit, because what we want people to do is choose voluntarily to learn more about this issue and not make them do it.
Right.
So, but there's a lot of different camps on that across the country, and we've never mandated it here on campus. What we've done is really encourage it. We've invited it. You'll notice in your pre-arrival campus course that you take, and I don't remember the name of it, but everyone takes it as a student. There is a little section on gender-based and sexual violence. We've just kind of popped it in there because we want you to be thinking about it. When we talk about faculty and staff, we've definitely done a lot of work with our staff and faculty on campus. We've created, one-pagers of how to respond to disclosures. We're actually in the midst of creating a course for staff to take, and we will probably be implementing it as for new instructors, and maybe kind of taking it for, students who don't know this. All of us staff on campus have kind of mandatory things that we do need to take as staff every year. And we're going to be exploring that, whether it's mandatory or where we're just kind of constantly invite people into the conversation.
So, Carmen, we talk about training, but what about some more formal bystander intervention training? What do you think that's a recommendation that all campuses should be taking advice on?
I really do. I think sometimes when we think about the issue of something so large and so heavy, such as gender-based and sexual violence, it just feels overwhelming. But there is so much that each of us can do. And bystander intervention just kind of takes all of that together and creates just different ways of thinking about how we can respond when we notice, when we see someone uncomfortable, when we need to call out a friend. And, unlike what might come to mind, like we're not like, stepping in between a conflict and getting ourselves hurt by it. Like not at all, right? But it gives us different ways to think about how do you respond when you know something isn't right.
Right.
And it kind of offers a chance for us to all self-reflect on what our role and responsibility is. Because, in spite of the discomfort of the issue, this really is a campus responsibility. Like each one of us needs to know our role and maybe just kind of have in the back of our minds one of those strategies to be able to intervene or support.
Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes students just don't realize how powerful they can be in creating that change.
Absolutely.
So when we think about then faculty and staff, what role do they have in prevention and support? How can even students advocate for better training or policies on campus? You mentioned policies before. So how can students advocate for some of that?
So I guess there's kind of two parts to this question. First is kind of what role do faculty and staff play? And I think we are so lucky, and students who are listening, I think you would agree, like we have an incredible staff team here, and faculty do so much to support their students, and that really we create a community here on campus. And really, like our job from Wellness Services in collaborating with your instructors is just to make sure they feel prepared to be able to respond to a disclosure if it comes, because we know that, students are more likely to talk to their instructors than they are to just immediately come to Wellness Services. You see your instructors every day, you build relationships with them. So we want to make sure they feel equipped. But interestingly, in the same way that we're telling you that you don't have to have all the answers, neither do faculty.
Right.
And probably good for you to know they don't about
Exactly.
stuff like this. Yeah. But, their job is just to make sure they're aware of the supports available on campus and that they let you lead, right, in the same way. I think, maintaining confidentiality, of course, is a really important piece that we talk to our staff and faculty about as well. And we do offer them trainings and opportunities to learn more. The second part of that question about how can students advocate, I'm just really thrilled to see this question, because I think one of the pieces that's missing on our campus right now, and that I'm kind of going to put a call out here for, is the student voice on this issue.
Yes.
You know, like we've done some surveys and we know that students are passionate about this topic, but, you know, I think Wellness Services and our campus together, we really want to create kind of that next step where students have a chance to advocate on this issue and their voices to be heard. Because it's really one thing for us who are in our careers to be talking about an issue, but like we're not you. Like we're not living the experiences you're living. And for students to be able to lead some of this work, it's powerful and it has huge opportunity for change. You know, so every one of us taking our little, you know, shovels and working away at the issue, like it has impact.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So just encouraging students, you know, to advocate and such, do you think, you know, forming some kind of coalition or peer group in some formal manner is something that could work?
I do. I think there's a couple of things that we could be exploring, and we'd love to hear from students on this. One being, you know, a peer support group, you know, just because there's really like a beautiful process that can happen when students who've experienced something similar to each other come together and talk about their experiences in a way that's safe for them. You know, experiences are very unique, but of course the impact sometimes has some similar themes. So being able to talk about it safely with others can be really helpful and supportive. I think another thing, though, is more of like advocacy spaces, like a coalition, like you're talking about. And sometimes those may have a crossover of students who like want to do it all. And sometimes those are different. And it doesn't mean you have to have been impacted by violence yourself to be passionate about it.
Exactly.
Right. And we need loud voices from students, because that's where we see like change in our societies. Right. If you are a student here and this is something you're excited about and that you have a lot of thoughts about, like we want to hear from you.
I guess the goal to ensure faculty and staff are equipped so that they can respond, you know, with sensitivity, with empathy, and effectively, I think is really important.
Carmen, what's your advice for someone who wants to help but isn't sure how?
Yeah, I like that you brought this question forward, because, you know, I think that's really common. People like do care about this. And when they know someone who's been impacted, like they want to do something, but they don't know where to start. I think, you know, like right now you're listening to this podcast. I think that's a huge step, right? Like even just taking the time to listen. But I think the first thing that comes to mind is just educate yourself, right? And self-reflect, you know, like pay attention and ask yourself whether these harmful narratives around gender and blame and, you know, these myths have impacted you. Question when people blame a survivor and the source of the power that was in that, you know, circumstance. And I think, so educate yourself, like attend events, learn about the resources so that you're ready if someone you love and care about needs that support. I think don't make assumptions about what it is, because these experiences are so unique and the impact is so unique that we can't just put this into a black and white situation all the time. Like it is very unique to the individual. So we may not ever understand individual circumstances around it, but just being willing to listen.
And I think we have to also accept that, I think like you mentioned in the statistics, there's a lot of historical disclosure of gender-based sexual violence, and that will affect how a person then is able to support another.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, I think taking into account where you are, if you're able to support. Because yes, you want to, but if you've got things going on, or if you're too overwhelmed with life or whatever, can you truly listen? Can you be non-judgmental? So even that, like reflecting on that and maybe letting the person know, I don't have the capacity right now to be the support you need, but I know of some other things that could be potentially.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make, because I mean, really, like probably any of the topics that have been on this podcast, you know, like when we talk about hard things and, you know, we're encouraging you to reach out to your friends and pay attention, but also like take care of yourself. Like these are heavy things to be dealing with. And we know that you're here for a reason, and that's to get your education and probably get out of here. But, you know, taking care of yourself and recognizing where your own boundaries are on the issue. And especially if you've experienced violence yourself, sometimes you really want to be that person to show up, and sometimes you can't. And that is like absolutely okay, because that's why we're here. And, you know, we're professionals who are trained to do this work. And really, if you can the only thing you're able to offer is to be a bridge to someone to get the support they need, or to make sure they at least know it's an option, that is enough. That's significant in and of itself.
It is. It's huge. Yeah.
And I think the biggest thing, if you're not sure, is just believing, right? Like no matter what, they're trusting you. They're sharing something difficult. Believe them. And if you don't know what to say, you can say that. You don't have to come up with some cliche or...
You could say, I believe you.
Yeah, I believe you. Yeah. Thanks
Steve's
for
wearing
sharing
a shirt.
with me. Yeah, Steve's wearing his I believe you shirt. Yeah, we got to narrate that, hey?
Yeah, for sure.
No video here. So we also want to highlight resilience. While the focus often falls on trauma, there's incredible strength in the stories of survivors. So Carmen, what are some ways survivors can reclaim their voice and agency, and how can campuses create spaces that empower this process?
I think this is really up to the individual. You know, there's a lot of things that we can say that could be helpful. And I mean, I'll talk about some of those things, but if you're listening, you know, I want you to know there isn't a right way to do this. I found that many survivors I've worked with, the main goal of their experience is to not have this happen again to someone else. And so for some, if it's really, like if it's safe to speak out, they do so. Sometimes that's really loudly, and sometimes it's in quiet, right? Through recording their record or through telling a friend, or, you know, there is no right way to do this, right? Some of the best advocates in any social issues are those who've actually experienced the issue themselves and want to change the experience for someone else. And what a beautiful takeaway from something like this, that resilience. You know, I think to draw back to those student-led initiatives, right? If you have experienced violence and it is safe for you to do so and it's empowering for you to do so, taking initiative and speaking out about the issue on campus and taking leadership roles here. You know, we've, through Wellness Services, developed a whole team of wellness ambassadors this year. That's one way that people are talking, you know, about taking charge of initiatives on campus regarding mental health and well-being, but taking your voice and using it for action if it's safe to do so and you know, is healing for you. For some people, it's not, right? And just being able to hold on to their story and maybe have a few people know about it is enough.
It's part of that storytelling, I think, can really empower somebody. But like you said, it doesn't have to be a public story.
No.
I mean, it can be anonymous, and we can look at, you know, how somebody tells their story. Could be vocally, or it could be through art or poetry. So there's so many ways that people can actually share their experience without having to identify themselves, for one, but being able to help others with building their resilience.
I'm not sure if we've talked about this yet, but I'd like to also add counseling. So potentially that could be a support. It can be a confidential space. It can be a way to share your story with someone who's not going to share it with others. But then also potentially, if that person wants, learning ways to move through, to move forward, to live with the trauma they've experienced and heal. So finding that as well.
I might add, Corinne, that just kind of made me think of something that, you know, we've talked a lot about sharing your story, but I would want students to also know that you can get support. You can go to counseling. You can come to like our GBSV support team and not tell us a single thing about what actually happened.
Right.
We haven't really said that here.
No,
and
we
that's
haven't, yeah.
really, really important to hear, I think, because we don't need to know the details at all. Like we don't need, unless you want to share them with us, you don't need to tell us a single thing about what happened. But what we can respond to is the impact of it, right? The how you feel about it now, how it's maybe impacting your life now, what you want to do with that, the fact that something did happen, right? And I think also like violence happens on so many levels that you may feel like hesitant to come forward if you don't feel like your experience of violence was bad enough.
Right.
Or hard enough, right?
Or big enough.
Or big enough, yeah. But I mean, like the impact is yours. Like how you feel about it and how it's changed you or is
making life harder.
Yeah, like there's never like a wrong experience, right? If it's impacting you, it's impacting you. And there's so many different ways that we can support, you know, your healing and resilience through that. But yeah, I felt like it was an important note to say you actually don't have to tell us anything about it to get support.
That can be a struggle for some, right? Yeah, or something they don't want to. So yeah, knowing there's ways to heal that you don't have to talk.
Yeah.
There's
And Corinne,
lots
you
of
talked
options.
about some of those already. And Steve, like, it's not, you don't have to come to us at all if you don't want to. You don't have to go to counseling. But what are those things in your life that, you can think of that life feels a little bit easier, a little bit better when you engage in them? And it's, again, like a really unique experience. For some people it is like creating art and not really caring what the product is, or finding that playlist that just moves a bit of those emotions, or getting out in nature, or spending time alone. Or maybe it's just like creating healthy boundaries in your life, right? With the people around you, to know that you have a choice of what your life looks like.
Could be some form of movement too.
Yes.
Like
Yoga.
going to the gym, yoga, like lifting heavy weights. Like
Totally.
just
Something.
it could be anything. So finding what works for you.
Yeah. Again, like this isn't the kind of thing that there's an obvious answer or solution to.
Yeah.
It's just what works for you to move it.
And really trying to reclaim their voice.
Yes.
I think we have to look at that narrative, right? We have to look at that narrative piece. We're moving from victimhood to survivorship. And we have to remember that people can reclaim that.
Yeah. And honor your process. Like, it's okay that it may take time. And like, there's not deadlines on supporting yourself or working through hard things, right?
Yeah, that brings to mind, like, sometimes there's this idea that I've had a traumatic experience, I go to counseling, I'm better. That's not true. There's actually quite a bit of research that says, like, with traumatic experiences, counseling may be something that you have to do in bits throughout your life.
Yeah.
Like, you will work on something, you will feel well, you will stop, you will live your life, and then maybe something else will come up and counseling might be supportive again. So it's not going to counseling is going to fix this or make it better. It might just help me move forward at this point in my life, and it might be something I'll have to explore again in the future.
What's the name of your podcast here? I'm thinking of The Fearless Journey, right? Of just like that, so much of the work that we do for ourselves and our mental health and well-being isn't like a one and done, that it's like a continuous process that is ever evolving and is so unique to your own life experiences.
Yeah, definitely.
Just to add, like, we've talked a lot about, we didn't specifically say self-care, but we've talked a lot about self-care. So that art, that therapy, music, journaling, physical activity, whatever it is for that person. One other thing that you may know if you've listened to a lot of our podcasts is that I'm really an advocate for mindfulness. So that can also potentially be a tool for somebody. And again, that mindfulness, if you need more information, go check out that podcast. But it doesn't have to be a quiet, self-reflective activity. It can just be something that is really present in the moment with whatever we're doing. Is that active? Is that quiet? Whatever it is. So just finding ways to be present in the moment. Sometimes mindfulness is really focusing on our body. And I know with traumatic experiences, that sometimes can be really, really difficult. So if mindfulness is a tool you want to explore, keeping that in mind, like maybe we need to be mindful about our surroundings, not our physical bodies in the moment, like figuring that out for ourselves, what works. And again, there's a podcast, there's lots of information, but I just wanted to add that potentially could be a tool for somebody. Like you mentioned, building resilience, something that potentially could be a way to build resilience, to build that self-empowerment, is finding something you want to learn about or you want to get better at. When we can find that thing, when we can learn about that thing, build skills in whatever that thing is, that can be a way to build up our confidence, to take back some of our power. So maybe that's a way for someone to build resilience.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And just to remind our listeners, every small action, believing a survivor, challenging harmful jokes, or learning more about consent, about gender-based and sexual violence can make a big difference.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up, we want to challenge each of you to take action. Start by educating yourself, learn about the resources available on campus and in your community.
Get involved in creating change. You can join or support campus initiatives, attend workshops on consent and bystander intervention, or even organize events to raise awareness about gender-based and sexual violence. Every small effort matters. Carmen, do you have any final comments?
I mean, you've really wrapped that up so well, but I think one last comment, for those of you who've been impacted, we're here for you. You do not have to do this work alone. You can reach out to us at any point in your experience, and it's never too late or too soon or too heavy or too insignificant, right? We can support you with providing tools, connecting you to resources, exploring your options, or just hearing your story.
And that's great. Just as a survivor, you're not alone. There's resources to help, like you said. Counseling. Here in Wellness Services, we've got counseling. I'm sure on other campuses, there's counseling. There's national hotlines, support groups in the community. So reaching out really is a sign of strength, not of weakness.
We also encourage you to keep the conversation going. Talk with friends, share this episode, and challenge the stigma around gender-based and sexual violence. Together, we can create a safer, more supportive campus.
Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, Fearless Journeys Thriving on Campus, so you never miss a great episode. Share it with someone who might benefit from today's conversation. It could really make all the difference.
Together, we have the power to transform our campuses into spaces where safety, respect, and compassion are the norm, because every voice matters and every action counts.